Our next speaker is Dr. Gorden Edwards, who is an expert in birds, insects, and has been an entomologist at San Jose State University for many, many years. There is a little article in your packet about a commentary on Our Stolen Future, which is probably the new Silent Spring. Dr. Edwards also contributed this little article about remembering Silent Spring and its consequences. He said that in 1962, Rachel Carson published Silent Spring, and I expected to be delighted with the book. It didn't take long to learn that she had filled the book with a great number of untruthful things. Vice President Al Gore has stated that Rachel Carson turned his life around. She turned mine around too, he said, but in the opposite direction, changing me from a, quote, environmentalist, unquote, to a scientist with a desire to keep truth in science and in environmentalism. I could no longer feel that environmentalism was wholesome and honorable. And today he will tell us some things about what really is the truth. I'll tell you just a little bit about his background. He did serve in World War II and was responsible for saving millions of lives because he dusted people with DDT to control body lice and prevent them from getting typhus, which had a mortality rate of about 80% and had killed 3 million Russians during World War I and millions during in the rest of Europe. The DDT stopped typhus in Europe during the war. He also contributed to the eradication of a big outbreak of bed bugs in Camp Forest, Tennessee, and is very interested in issues that are preventing us from controlling the outbreak of many epidemic diseases that are forgotten but not gone. Dr. Edwards.
Well, thank you. That was the best part of my talk right there. Yeah, I want to appreciate, I appreciate being invited to come here and speak to all you people. And I have to explain why I'm still talking about DDT this long after it's been banned here. There are two reasons that come to mind. One is that we still have a great use of, for DDT and other chemicals to control diseases in tropical countries. Third world countries have really not recovered very much. The second reason is I hate to see scientists getting away with passing off information that's not true. And the ones that did it in the past are still out there talking. They're talking about new things now. However, the principles are the same. So these are the reasons I'm still talking about DDT. In my classes at San Jose State, I don't mention this. I'm too busy talking about the insects. For years, I was nothing but an ornithologist. And then I discovered that entomology, I thought, was more important than ornithology to me because of agricultural entomology. And after Rachel Carson, of course, we began to realize that agricultural entomology is dangerous because of the pesticides that are used. And in addition to that, my primary course is medical entomology. And this, of course, involves all kinds of insect control measures, because many of the diseases cannot be controlled adequately with medication. So I have no intention of finishing all this today, but I thought I would just give you some things that were interesting to me that you may not have heard before. I like to use exact quotations, and I hate to ad-lib things which might be misquoted, of course. But when Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring, I was in a research station at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And I thought it was great, because I'd always been an environmentalist. Nature Study Club of Indiana for years, Audubon Society, Sierra Club, and so forth. In fact, the Audubon Society has published 2 of my articles, and the Sierra Club published a book that I wrote. So I'm not really opposed to those 2 organizations, but it's gotten quite different now. The most recent thing in the Sierra Club, a fellow named Foreman was placed as the 5th officer in the Sierra Club. You may have heard about Foreman because he was writing a book called Monkey Wrenching, How to Destroy Equipment, How to Spike Trees, and so forth. Now we have the president, vice president, secretary, treasurer, and the next officer in the Sierra Club is David Foreman. And this sort of changes the whole idea of the Sierra Club as far as I'm concerned. Well, after all this work, I still like to look back at the details behind it. Rachel Carson wrote the book Silent Spring. And a few quotes from Rachel Carson's book, I presume you've all read it. and maybe felt the same way I did about it. I got halfway through the book, I was still in her favor. And I began to see too many things I knew were not right. I went back and started over again. And this time I took notes. And at a later time, the notes were actually published. But to give a few of these, Rachel Carson wrote, "Like the robin," this is a quote, "like the robin, another American bird seems to be on the verge of extinction, the bald eagle." Well, the robin was never endangered at all. Roger Torrey Peterson, who recently died, unfortunately, in writing in, what was the name, the Life Nature Library, cited robin as being the most abundant bird in North America. That was written in 1962, the same year that Rachel Carson wrote Silent Spring. It's either on the verge of extinction, or it's the most abundant bird in North America, and you know which authority I prefer. The Christmas bird count, the Audubon Society, I was frequently on Christmas bird counts back in Indiana, and I had a lot of fun. So do the other people on the counts. But unfortunately, as birds became more abundant, the Christmas bird count became a weapon to use against the Audubon Society, because the Christmas bird count showed increases instead of decreases during the DDT years. And I found it very, very interesting. The number of cowbirds, 21 times more abundant after DDT than before DDT. Of course, cowbirds are the primary reason for many warbirds becoming quite scarce now, because the cowbirds lay their eggs in the nest, and the young cowbird gets more food than the original warbler young. And they're really eradicating a lot of population of good birds. There are 38 times more blackbirds, 131 times more grackles, and so forth, even more eagles. So the Audubon Christmas bird count became a weapon against the Audubon Society's war on DDT. In fact, we eventually filed libel suit against the New York Times and the Audubon Society, and won our libel suit in a New York court. The people that they said had been paid to lie about the Christmas bird counts included Norman Borlaug and Thomas Jukes and Robert White Stevens and myself and Donald Spencer of the Fish and Wildlife Service. But at least they stopped talking about us as being paid liars, because we were using the Christmas bird counts to show that there were more birds instead of fewer birds. Now, she also wrote that pheasant sickness became a well-known phenomenon. She says the birds seek water, become paralyzed, are found in the ditch banks quivering. According to one observer, unquote, I don't know who the one observer was, but you've all seen articles like that. And Rudd and Gently, who wrote the article in Condor magazine, 1955, were experimenting with a pen of 12 pheasants. Into the food of the pheasants, they mixed DDT. I thought you'd be interested in the rate. 1.5 pounds of DDT per 100 pounds of rice in the food given the pheasants. Dr. Rudd stated in his article, quote, "This concentration is equivalent to 1 to 15,000 parts per million of DDT in the diet." Why would anybody use 15,000 parts per million of anything in a diet? Well, the result was he had 12 pheasants in a pen, and let's see, 7 of the birds survived, 5 of them showed no symptoms. My only conclusion is that the ones that didn't show any symptoms didn't eat any of the food, but that was not mentioned in the article. So we have a lot of funny articles. Let's see now. Rachel Carson, I was concerned because I was teaching medical entomology. Rachel Carson wrote, "Only yesterday mankind lived in fear of scourges of smallpox, cholera, and plague. Now our major concern is no longer with the disease organisms. Better living conditions and new drugs have given us control over infectious disease. Today we're concerned with a different kind of hazard that lurks in the environment." Unquote. She went into many pages of unsupported attacks on insecticides, never mentioned the millions of human lives that have been saved by DDT from malaria death and yellow fever, plague, encephalitis, typhus, elephantiasis, leishmaniasis, the whole work. She wasn't concerned about those things. And this bothered me as a medical entomologist. And eventually I turned around and became devoted to refuting what Rachel Carson had said. And the list goes on. She also mentioned work by DeWitt. She talked about, never know what time it is now. I'm going to follow my clock. So DeWitt, she says, his classic experiment, quail into whose diet DDT was introduced throughout the breeding season, survived, this is her quote, and even produced normal numbers of fertile eggs, but few of the eggs hatched, unquote. I was concerned. I went and got the original article in the Journal of Agriculture and Food Chemistry. I was shocked to find the article had a very different conclusion. DeWitt showed that The quail were fed 200 parts per million of DDT in all their food throughout the breeding season. And his table shows that after producing normal numbers of eggs, as she said, they hatched 80% of the eggs if they were on the DDT diet. The control birds with no DDT hatched 83.9%. And this time I still believed in Rachel Carson. I thought maybe she said fewer of the eggs, because I couldn't imagine anybody saying 80% hatch with few eggs hatching. But apparently she meant it just like she said it. So who would consider 80% hatches being few of the eggs hatching? Not I. He had pheasants on the same table, and the pheasants, the controls with no DDT, only hatched 57% of the eggs, and the DDT-fed birds hatched more than 80% of the eggs. So the experiment fell a bit short in my estimation. Let's see. She also dedicated a book, you probably have read. She dedicated the book Silent Spring, dedicated to Dr. Albert Schweitzer, who said, quote, "Man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth," unquote. I'm sure that she knew he was referring to atomic warfare when she quoted that, but being suspicious and thinking she implied that he was talking about pesticides like DDT being deadly, I got his autobiography, and I found on page 262 that he did refer to DDT. He said, quote, "How much labor and waste of time these wicked insects do cause us, but a ray of hope in the use of DDT is now held out to us," unquote. So much for her dedication, in more ways than one. Now, in 1967, the Audubon Society financed the establishment of the Environmental Defense Fund, the EDF, which had become quite famous, I'm sure. They could then legally lobby for Audubon propaganda issues without endangering the Society's tax-exempt status. And the founder, Victor Yannicone, was paid $60,000 a year for part-time work. And Charles Worcester joined the EDF as the chief scientist. Worcester listed his specialty in American Man of Science. His specialty was listed as being jet fuels and fuel luminosity. But Victor Yannicone told me that he told Worcester, "Charlie, you better do some environmental biological work since you're the chief biologist for the EDF." So Worcester then, I should have mentioned that Yannicone and Worcester together in the Wisconsin hearings were able to ban DDT in the state of Wisconsin in 1968-69. And Worcester boasted at that time in Bioscience magazine, quote, "If the environmentalists can win on DDT, they will achieve and quite probably retain in other environmental issues a level of authority they have never had before. So much more is at stake than DDT," unquote. So Yannicone urged him to perform some kind of biological research, so Worcester got some tanks of seawater, put some marine algae in them, poured large amounts of DDT in the tanks to see if it would harm the algae. He wrote, quote, "To each flask of DDT, ethanol was added in order to get the desired concentrations. I noticed in Science magazine the desired concentration was 500 parts per billion. We already knew that DDT only goes into solution in water at 1.2 parts per billion, so I wondered how he got the 500 parts per billion. He very truthfully wrote it in his article. He added alcohol to get it into solution. And I wondered what the effect would be on the algae. Well, we already had Ukele Ravenna, who had found that 600 parts per billion of DDT without solvents did not affect the algae, the same algae. And Menzel reported a beneficial effect on algae with 700 parts per billion of DDT added to the culture. That was in Science magazine 1970. Well, Worcester published his results in Science magazine, March 1968, and Dr. Paul Ehrlich, you've all heard of, expanded on Worcester's hoax. He wrote what he called a scenario based upon Worcester's work. He titled the scenario Eco-Catastrophe, published it in Ramparts magazine, not quite a scientific journal, but widely read, and that was in August 1969. His article began with the statement, "The end of the ocean came late in the summer of 1979. I missed that. It came even more rapidly than the biologists had expected, he said. There had been signs for more than a decade, commencing with the discovery in 1968 that DDT slows down photosynthesis in marine plant life. It was announced in a short paper in Science, but to ecologists it smacked of doomsday. They knew that DDT and similar chlorinated hydrocarbons had polluted the entire surface of the earth, including the sea," unquote. So thousands of school children were assigned reading this Ramparts magazine article because the teachers warned them that it shows how humans are endangering the earth with pesticides. Later, I was delighted to find that Ehrlich also published the same identical article, Eco Catastrophe, in England, 1970, a British journal, the title of which is The Year's Best Science Fiction. I thought that was a more appropriate outlet for Ehrlich's work. Now, there were claims against DDT, and although at first the anti-DDT crowds alleged that DDT was killing off adult birds, they soon had to admit that it was not. They were not, quote, dropping out of the sky dead, unquote. That's alleged in Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences. Nor were they, quote, falling out of the trees by the thousands, as stated in Innovation magazine. So they changed the story and said it was only killing nestling birds. But the Journal of Wildlife Management published articles describing the tests where they fed nothing but DDT-contaminated food to nestling birds, and the birds were not affected. In fact, the leader in this field, Bill Hazeltine, you may have heard about, asked Dr. Hickey, how much DDT did you give the robins you're trying to kill? And that irritated Hickey considerably. He insisted he wasn't trying to kill them. Besides, they didn't even get sick. They just got diarrhea. Got rid of all the DDT that way. Anyway, the activists were having trouble then. Next, they said perhaps DDT makes the eggs sterile, or maybe it kills the developing embryos. That was refuted by the tremendous hordes of birds counted by the Christmas bird counts and the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary migration counts. They also had to explain the population explosions of predaceous white-tailed kites in heavily sprayed California, and of robins, starlings, cowbirds, and red-winged blackbirds throughout North America. So they tried saying that not all birds were affected, but only the predators. Well, that was evident wrong also, because the predators were also multiplying rapidly. They decided that not all predators were affected, but only those that preyed on fish. But fish-eating murres, ospreys, and gulls were also rapidly increasing. On Funk Island along the North Atlantic coast, the murres increased from 15,000 pairs in 1945, before DDT, to 1.5 million pairs by 1971, after massive DDT use. And the gannets there went from 200 pairs to 3,000 pairs during the same time. Herring gulls in Massachusetts exploded during the DDT decades, from 2,000 pairs in 1941 to 35,000 pairs by 1971. They're on the protected list, but Massachusetts gave the Audubon bird lovers permission to poison 30,000 of them on Turn Island. And the local Audubon president, William Dury, said, quote, "It's kind of like weeding a garden," unquote. That was in Audubon magazine, January 1985. Well, then the zealots claimed the eggshells were either becoming so thick that the young couldn't get out of the eggs. That was in San Francisco Chronicle, 14th of February 1969. Or they were becoming so thin they're being broken by the weight of the incubating females. Same newspaper 3 months later. So eventually they settled on the latter as being essentially the only harm done to bird by DDT and DDE was making the shells thin. I'm sure you heard all about that. Thin shell story was hard to sell because they couldn't explain the thin shells that occurred before DDT was used, and they couldn't explain the lack of effects on eggs of captive birds that were heavily dosed with DDT or DDE. So they had a little difficulty, but finally they had to simply resort to endlessly repeating all the old allegations, hoping that most people had not heard about the refutations. And the failure of the news media to report the truth had helped them get away with that ruse. Pseudo-environmental magazines frightened readers with the same unsubstantiated myths, and in return they got a lot of money, which we all know that the environmental groups need. But I hated to see it done in that way. Now, the Audubon Society distributed hundreds of thousands of yellow propaganda leaflets. They were actually yellow. They stated, quote, "DDT should be banned throughout the land and banned from export," unquote. And I was worried as a medical entomologist about that. In the news release dated 25th of February 1971, the president of the Sierra Club stated, quote, "The Sierra Club wants a ban, not just a curb, on persistent pesticides, even in the tropical countries where DDT has kept malaria under control," end of quote. These actions were taken full knowledge that the ban on DDT would result in the death of more than 30 million third world inhabitants a year. But it's the leaders, not the members of these organizations, that exercise policy. I like a lot of members in the group, but the leadership has gotten pretty bad. And now we have Victor Yannicone, in speech to the paper industry, the Union League Club in New York, 20th of May 1970, described an incident in which a reporter asked Charles Worcester, the chief biologist, the alga specialist, asked Worcester if a DDT ban wouldn't result in greater use of much more toxic pesticides that had a long history of killing people. He said, Worcester responded, quote, "So what? People are the cause of all the problems. We have too many of them. We need to get rid of some of them, and this is as good a way as any, unquote. He was then asked, Doctor, how do you square the killing of people with the mere loss of some birds? And Yannicone says Worcester answered, quote, it doesn't really make a lot of difference because the organophosphate acts locally and only kills farm workers, and most of them are Mexicans and Negroes, unquote. That was reported by Congressman Rarick during the hearings of the Federal Pesticide Control Act of 1971. Congressman Dale DeGarza was there, and he was outraged they couldn't force Worcester to testify. Now, Yannicone had also told me that the statements like that were leading him to consider withdrawing from the Environmental Defense Fund because he was formerly a civil rights attorney. He began to feel he was working with the wrong people, so he did resign that year. During our libel trial in 1976, he telephoned and asked if he could testify on our behalf against the Audubon Society. That was a shock. We didn't know if we could trust him or not, but we did. His testimony helped convince the jury. He said that he was in the Audubon Society office when they were deciding what to do about our use of the Audubon bird count to reveal that DDT had not adversely affected bird populations. So we won the suit. It was overruled later well, don't we get too involved in this, but it was overruled, so we didn't worry about our personal health anymore. And we also knew that they would never mention us in their columns again as being paid liars by the pesticide industry. Now, the allegations that DDT caused bird populations to experience general declines were wrong because it actually showed that DDT increased the populations. And I don't have time to go into great detail on this, but you get better vegetation growth if you can use a pesticide such as DDT. Also, there are fewer parasites to be transmitted by mosquitoes and black flies and all the blood-sucking insects that bother birds. And we also have the situation that DDT stimulates the liver to produce more hepatic enzymes, and these enzymes do protect the body from cancer and tumors. In many cases, this is shown to be true. And especially if the birds are eating aflatoxins in moldy grain, they can be protected from cancer because of the presence of DDT working upon the enzymes in the liver. So it has some beneficial results. Now I wanted to go, I forget when I'm supposed to stop. I'm watching my clock, but it doesn't do me good. Do I have until 11:15, is that correct? 11:15. I'll talk faster. I wanted to say, look at some of the birds that were allegedly threatened by DDT. So this is very important, I thought, to see how the environmentalists use DDT propaganda. After 20 years of heavy DDT use in California, that was 2 million pounds a year, which is only about a fifth what they use in Florida. But in California, in 1968, they surveyed Anacapa Island off the Southern California coast for the Smithsonian Institution. And they wrote that while fluctuations in numbers do occur, there has been no apparent decline in recent years along the California coast. Now, just a few months later, actually it was January 28, 1969, the Santa Barbara oil spill occurred near the Southern California coast, and the oil surrounded Anacapa Island, where the major, supposedly the only population of brown pelicans was nesting. Two biologists went out to see how much damage the oil was causing to sea lions, and they reported in Cry, California, a local publication, that the brown pelican colony had many soft or broken eggshells in and near the nest. The pelican had experienced no difficulty during the years of heavy DDT use, but suddenly a reproductive failure 15 years later, 2 months after the great oil spill had surrounded their colony. Scientists, I thought, should have been impressed by that, but it wasn't even mentioned in the reports about pelican nesting failures by either federal or state wildlife agencies. Government biologists later admitted they had collected 72% of the intact eggs in the pelican colony for analysis. And that seemed likely to reduce the reproductive success, I thought. The analysis of the eggs showed it showed an inverse statistical correlation between DDT and shell thickness in Nature magazine, 1972. Some of the thinnest shells were those of the eggs with low DDT levels. The higher DDT concentrations were often in thick-shelled eggs. Now, my student collaborator, Richard Main, was employed by the National Park Service for 2 years after that. He trapped Norway rats in the pelican nests on the island. Also, feral cats were roaming the island because a man named Frenchie used to live there at Frenchie's Cove, and he had moved out and left his cats. They were surviving on rats, mice, and pelicans. And the National Park Service wanted to poison the rats to protect the young pelicans. Fish and Game Department said they could not do it because they feared that native rodents might also be killed. So they had to stop that. The oil film through which the pelicans were diving for fish was rich in mercury, known to result in serious adverse effects on birds, eggs, and the young. But R.B. Finley, who was in charge of Fish and Wildlife Service pelican studies throughout the United States, responded to criticisms in my congressional testimony by writing to Congressman Pogue, the head of the committee, on 2nd of August 1971. He said, quote, "There is not a shred of evidence that spilled oil is capable of causing thin-shelled eggs or otherwise affecting bird populations," unquote. On the contrary, Journal of Wildlife Management said oil on eggs reduces hatchability by 68%. National Wildlife Federation said oil in the feathers of the bird causes embryo mortality. And King, in Bulletin of Environmental Contamination and Toxicology, said oil is the cause of pelican mortality for 6 weeks after it's spilled. And Dieter wrote that oil on eggs kills 76 to 98% of the embryos. The birds ingesting oil produce 70 to 100% fewer eggs than normal. Liver and spleen atrophy result from the exposure to the oil. And Sorrow reported that oil causes kidney nephrosis, pancreatic degeneration, and lipid pneumonia, and so forth. I'll stop with that. But obviously, to me, Finley didn't know a whole lot about the effect of oil, in spite of his statement that there's not a shred of evidence that spilled oil is capable of causing thin-shelled eggs or otherwise affecting bird reproduction. I later had trouble with Finley also. But Dawson wrote a book, Birds of California, described how merely the brief presence of a human on Anacapa caused the adult pelican to spring from the nest, breaking their eggs with their feet as they did so, and how, quote, "the exposed eggs and nestlings are quickly eaten by morating gulls." Fish and wildlife biologists in charge even admitted, in the 35th North American Wildlife Conference, 1970, admitted they had shotgunned a pelican sitting on their nest of eggs, so they can compare the DDT residues in the birds with those in their eggs. Imagine what that did to the colony. And we were convinced they were trying to eradicate the colony so they could get DDT banned during the EPA hearings, and I suppose the pelicans would have come back sometime later. They almost succeeded, but they didn't quite eradicate the colony because Richard Main and I wrote regulations for the Department of Interior that would keep the biologists, who we called the predators, off the island during the next breeding season. And there was a great increase in population as a result. Hard to fight those people. Now, in the eastern United States, we had T. Gilbert Pearson, 1918, was asked by the federal government to survey the brown pelicans along the 1,500-mile coast of the Gulf of Mexico, all the way from Key West around to Boca Chica at the mouth of the Rio Grande. Wrote in National Geographic magazine in 1934, he estimated a total of 65,000 pelicans during that 1918 survey. Robert Allen, the president of the National Audubon Society, duplicated the survey in 1934, found only 900 pelicans in all of Texas. Published a result in Auk magazine, in which he said, quote, "In 1918, Dr. T. Gilbert Pearson estimated the total number of brown pelicans on the Texas coast not to exceed 5,000. Thus, in 16 years, there has been a decrease of about 82%, unquote. Dropped to about 200 in 1939. That was still 4 years before DDT was developed. And since it's axiomatic that effects cannot precede their causes, of course, it's unlikely that the pelican declined in anticipation of DDT. But they might have. Well, I reported all these things to Congressman Pogue's hearing before the House Agricultural Committee in March '71, and my friend Finley, again, was issuing bulletins repeated by Fish and Wildlife Service spokesmen across the nation, stating that, quote, "a catastrophic decline has occurred on the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, where a population of over 50,000 brown pelicans has all but disappeared since 1961, unquote. The cause, they said, was DDT. In 1961, Van Tetz saw the last active nesting colony in Louisiana. It only had 200 pairs, and this was reported in the AOU monograph of Pelicaniformes. Those, plus the 5,000 reported in Texas by Allen of the Audubon Society, fell far short of the alleged 50,000 that Finley was talking about. So I called Finley to ask him for details. And he wrote to me saying, quote, "In response to your inquiry, I've investigated the source of the reported 50,000 brown pelicans formerly on the Texas and Louisiana coast. The only comprehensive estimate was made by T. Gilbert Pearson, 65,000 birds. He didn't realize it had been in National Geographic. He talked about his 1937 book. He then cited 5 references dated 1879 to 1955, and his conclusion was, quote, although the reports are sketchy, Jim Keith, who's the Department of Interior head, and I both feel the estimate of 50,000 is not unreasonably high. That was in March 1971. 5 months later, in August, he wrote to Congressman Pogue, criticizing my testimony, but he also stated in that letter, quote, I like this one, the year 1961 was merely a hasty approximation of an unknown time. After reviewing the evidence, I think I should have said the 50,000 pelicans disappeared by 1961 instead of since 1961. The total number didn't exceed 300 along the entire Texas coast in 1942, so he had to somehow explain how it got from 300 up to 50,000 in that short time by 1961, during the heaviest years of DDT usage. Well, jumping down a little bit further here, the endangered osprey, a fellow named J.J. Hickey at Wisconsin, in his book Guide to Birdwatching, 1943, before DDT, attributed a 70% decline of eastern ospreys to pole trapping around fish hatcheries. 70% decline. After DDT was developed, he ignored the pole trapping and the shooting, blamed only DDT for all the bird declines. But at Hawk Mountain, Pennsylvania, I was a member of the Hawk Mountain Sanctuary Association for years, so I could get all the details. The survey of migrating ospreys appeared as follows: 191 in 1946, 254 in 1951, 352 in 1961, on up to 529 in 1969, before DDT was banned, and 630 in 1972, the year DDT was banned. Difficult to believe the propaganda that DDT threatened their extinction, when more were migrating every year following the introduction of DDT. And later, the sanctuary reported in 1975 that for reasons we do not understand at all, this is a quote, the number of ospreys going south is returning to something like normal. Instead of up to 630 after DDT was used, it's returning now to 318 in 1974 and 279 in 1975. So I guess without the DDT, they just couldn't stand very well. They were disappearing again. Bald eagles, very important. Suffered a lot at the hands of man, but not because of DDT. In 1917, Alaska enacted legislation providing a bounty of 50 cents per eagle. And from then until 1952, they paid bounties on 128,000 dead eagles, more than $100,000 they paid. 1921 article in Ecology magazine, the title was Threatened Extinction of the Bald Eagle. And that was in Alaska, primarily. But in 1930s, there were no records of bald eagles in most of New England, not more than 25 in Ohio, 10 in Pennsylvania, 15 along the Chesapeake Bay, and Birdlore magazine stated this will give some idea of the rarity of the eagle in eastern United States. That was 14 years before DDT existed. Then we had the Christmas bird counts. 1941, before DDT was used, they saw 197 bald eagles. 1960, after 15 years of heavy DDT use, the count was 891. If the results had been reversed, I would have worried about DDT myself. But it didn't look like they're having much trouble because of DDT. The Hawk Mountain Sanctuary shows the counts doubled during the first 6 years of heavy DDT use in eastern United States. And then we have a book called America's Eagle Heritage, 1965, talking about the eagles in Everglades, which was also mentioned, I think, in Our Stolen Future that you've all heard about lately. In 1959, there were 24 active nests. They produced 18 young. 1964, there were 51 nests producing 41 young. Quite a sizable increase. An Everglades biologist in 1973, the year that DDT was actually banned, said the population is stable, is reproducing at a rate more than adequate to maintain its numbers, and there is no evidence the region ever supported a larger number of nesting eagles, unquote. Then we have Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland, Department of Fish and Wildlife Service, performed autopsies on all 76 bald eagles found dead in eastern United States between 1960 and 1965. None of the deaths were blamed on DDT. 46 had been shot or trapped, 7 died of impact injuries flying into buildings. And they did another autopsy on 652 more between 1965 and 1980 across the nation. The major cause of death was always shooting and trapping. Also many deaths from electrocution, high tension wires, or impact. And, quote, the scientists concluded that the role of pesticides had been greatly exaggerated, which was an understatement, I thought. That's in Journal of Wildlife Diseases, 1970. And in 1972, the carcasses contained twice as much PCB as DDT, DDD, and DDE combined. and the brains had 4 times as much PCB. That was in the Pesticide Monitoring Journal, 1972. Now, they had a multi-million-dollar federal project financed for captive rearing and releasing of bald eagles. So they took the eggs from successful nests, incubated, reared them, released them into the wild. Each year, up to 75 were released in the southeastern states. And in Natural History magazine, surprisingly, in May 1992, Peter Nye wrote, quote, "My colleagues and I identified 80 locations in New York believed to have been bald eagle nesting sites since 1880. By 1940, only a handful were there. Yet he said, quote, the oft-mentioned culprit, DDT, wasn't put into use until the last few nesting eagles were already struggling for survival." So we imported eaglets from Alaska beginning in 1976, including 49 in the first 3 years, and now a healthy population is here. We eventually hope to have 40 nesting pairs in the state. So in summary, the bald eagles didn't do much damage, didn't have much trouble either. However, the news media continue to attribute the increase since the ban to one thing, that 1972 ban on DDT. Then we come to peregrine falcons. I could spend hours talking about peregrine falcons, but in 1967, first going back to the Second World War, the British government was concerned because the peregrines were killing the carrier pigeons that were bringing messages back from Europe. And so the British government sponsored the shooting of as many peregrines as possible, and they killed about 600 to protect the pigeons. Then Ratcliffe, unaware of that program, but having heard about the North American propaganda on eggshells, Ratcliffe hypothesized that DDT may be threatening the peregrines. And he didn't have any equipment to measure shell thickness, so he simply tried to see how thin the shells might be by weighing the eggs. And he proposed a shell thickness index based upon external measurements and weight. And some anti-DDT activists in the United States used the shell thickness index too. Didn't have much luck with it for various reasons I won't go into here. But meanwhile, back in Britain, the Wilson Report, the British Federal Advisory Committee on Pesticides in 1969, had pointed out that peregrine decline had ended in 1966, even though DDT was still as abundant as ever. And their conclusion was there is no close correlation between the decline in populations of predatory birds, especially the peregrine falcon, and the use of DDT. And then Gunn, in another Annals of Applied Biology, pointed out there was not enough DDT present in 1947 to cause thinner eggshells in Britain. And he said an effect coming before its cause is utterly unacceptable, which I have to agree with. In 1980, Ratcliffe wrote another book, The Peregrine Falcon, 416 pages, and he retracted his statements about DDT and the peregrines, but nobody in the environmental movement has ever referred to his book. Meanwhile, in the United States, falcons were becoming extremely rare in eastern United States long before DDT. 1913, William Hornaday, the head of the New York Zoological Society, wrote in a book, Our Vanishing Wildlife, page 226, that peregrines are undesirable. And this is a quote, "They deserve death, but are so rare that we need not take them into account," unquote. Persons who found a nest were urged, quote, "shoot the parents and destroy the eggs or young in the nest," unquote. Egg collectors liked them, though. They didn't like that. They often specialized in peregrine eggs. Roger Torrey Peterson, in Birds Over America, 1948, wrote, quote, "One collector in Philadelphia showed a cabinet full of eggs, drawer upon drawer. This awesome display represented years when nests in eastern Pennsylvania fledged scarcely a single young bird. The Boston oologist, or egg collector, was reputed to have more than 700 peregrine eggs. One collector said he secured the eggs from a special nest each year for 29 years, but that site is no longer occupied," unquote. He complained, quote, he said, quote, "The falconers often climb the cliffs first and daub into ink on the eggs to make them worthless to oologists," end of quote. And then Berger referred to the prevalence for 70 years of fanatic egg collecting. In the book, The Duck Hawk and the Falconers, reported, quote, "Falconers in the East raided every nest every year, keeping the birds on the brink of extinction, and farmers and hunters contributed to their demise by shooting them on sight and destroying their eggs and young," as Hornaday had suggested. By the time DDT was introduced, there were literally no peregrine populations in eastern United States. But the anti-pesticide extremists later placed the peregrine populations in eastern United States. Something wrong here. The anti-pesticide extremists later placed the blame on DDT anyway, is what it should have said. W.H. Sickle of Fish and Wildlife Service wrote, quote, "One could explain the observed phenomena at least as well by a theory of poisoning by metals such as lead or mercury," unquote. Now, in the 1960s, the peregrines in northern Canada were reproducing normally according to the literature, even though they contained 30 times more DDT, DDD, and DDE than the Midwestern peregrines that were allegedly being extirpated by those chemicals. In fact, the peregrine, I like this one, contained the very highest DDT residue level ever found, according to Auk magazine. It contained 2,435 parts per million. It was efficiently feeding her 3 healthy young at the time. Tom Cade, who founded the Peregrine Fund Incorporated, told the Associated Press, quote, "As far as is known, peregrine falcons completely disappeared east of the Rocky Mountains in the 1960s. The fund has not been able to reestablish the subspecies of peregrine that live in the east. It is probably extinct. But the captive breeding program has introduced other subspecies that have taken hold." And they keep talking about how they've reintroduced the peregrine to the east, but they really haven't. Cade in 1977 requested permission from the Fish and Wildlife Service to take some birds from nests in northern Mexico, because he said, quote, "A regional director of the Fish and Wildlife Service suddenly decided in June that no more peregrines of European origin are to be released in the eastern United States, thus leaving us with a large number of Spanish and Scottish peregrines on our hands." Well, getting back to, I thought it was untruthful, by the way, to refer to this, the offspring of Western Canadian, Mexican, Spanish, and Scottish falcons as being, quote, "endangered eastern peregrines," and to publicize the release of those birds in the eastern United States as being, quote, "reintroductions of the eastern peregrine falcon." But one of my problems is I taught many years, I taught courses in systematics, and we had to define species and subspecies at the time. And so we realized that these were not the same subspecies, even though the environmentalists kept saying they were. According to Frank Beebe, who's the leading peregrine specialist in Canada, 1975, he said, quote, "The subspecies that is reproducing most successfully in the cages at Cornell is the Western Canadian maritime subspecies," which he names, which has never been endangered. And Frank Beebe also wrote in The Myth of the Vanishing Peregrine Falcon, where he exposed the political and financial dealings involved. They go into Alaska along the Colville River and shoot most of the peregrines, and then the next year go back and say the peregrine population is not doing well. After all, they shot them and took their eggs. They also had, well, no time for more detail, but very interesting story. Beebe, I thought, should be applauded for concluding, quote, "It appears that the Canadian Arctic peregrines, not knowing how gravely ill they are, go right on reproducing in blissful unconcern of their desperate plight," unquote. Now, in 1985, Bill Burnham, who was the director of the funds at that time, the Peregrine Fund, said, quote, "We're having a terrible time trying to fund the program in the face of 50 million people starving in Ethiopia. The Peregrine Fund's goal is to establish a $7 million endowment to help pay its estimated $1 million annual expense." So the Endangered Species Act provided much of the funding for that propagation and release programs. The group has released more than 3,700 peregrines into the wild. So guess what is responsible for the noble peregrine falcon recovering? The ban of DDT in 1972. Now, we had bird eggshell thinning programs, and I obviously don't have time to go into that, but the results from 3 experiments were the only ones used in the EPA hearings. Bittman of the Fish and Wildlife Service and his colleagues were feeding the birds calcium-deficient diets and giving them high levels of DDT, blaming the thin eggshells on the DDT. And that was published in Nature magazine and also in Science magazine. And I spent a lot of time discussing that before another congressional committee. Apparently Bittman read my discussions, because he later repeated the experiment. This time he said we gave the birds adequate calcium and fed them DDT and DDD. And his study, if I can find it here, the result was that both the DDT-fed and the DDE-fed birds produced better eggshells than the controls. So this has been found a lot of other times too. They sought to publish the article in Science magazine, but it was rejected. They finally had to publish it in Poultry Science, 1971. So why was it rejected by Science magazine? Well, the science editor of Science magazine, Philip Abelson, had written to Dr. Thomas Jukes, that some of you have heard about, wrote that Science would never publish anything favorable to DDT as long as I am the editor. That included Bittman's work showing that DDT did not cause thin eggshells. The second experiment that was widely used was by Peakall, P-E-A-K-A-L-L, at Cornell. All Peakall did, he was working with little doves, and he says, I hate to ad lib on anything, he kept his doves in a communal cage on a series of 16 hours of light and 8 hours of dark every day. When ready for the experiment, he put the female of each pair into isolation and changed the schedule to only 8 hours of light a day. Same time, he fed them 10 parts per million of DDT in all their food. Now, poultry would have stopped laying entirely under these conditions with the light cut like that, but the doves kept on producing eggs. It took 21 hours instead of 16 hours to produce a good egg, but the shells were still thick. So he next injected intraperitoneally a dose of 150 milligrams per kilogram of DDE at 300,000 times the daily level of DDT eaten by humans. The doves still laid their eggs, but they became lighter than normal. So it's already known, of course, that any reduction in illumination causes birds to produce thinner eggshells. I have a lot of articles on that. Providing adequate light is just as important as your vaccination, parasite control, and feeding programs. And when bulbs are dirty, the hen receives less light than she needs, and the stress may be severe enough to cause a premature molt, and certainly no eggs could be produced. And British poultry science reported that the most critical area of light intensity change is the range between 8 hours and 16 hours, and decreasing photo periods depress the rate of lay, unquote. But it was interesting that Pico used those hours, 16 hours, cut to 8 hours a day, and then blame it on DDT. Now, Heath was feeding mallard ducks, and the ducks actually seemed to benefit. The ones fed 2.5 parts per million DDT in all their food produced 40% more young than controls. Those fed 10 parts per million produced 81% more than controls. His conclusion stated that, quote, DDT in concentrations of 2.5 and 10 parts per million did not have measurable effects on reproduction, unquote. We called this to his attention that they had actually produced 40% to 81% more. He said, well, he was indicating that DDT did not interfere with reproduction when he said it had no effect on reproduction. So people who only read the title were convinced that the DDT was causing trouble to the ducks. Now, the causes of eggshell thinning, I'm running short on time, so I'll simply say that a lot of things that birds can eat that destroy oviposition. Lead, mercury, PCBs, 7,2,4-D, cadmium, lithium, chromium, selenium, sulfur. In fact, sulfa drugs, especially sulfanilamide, will cause eggs with no shell at all. And Tucker in Utah Science, he's the Fish and Wildlife Service, but he was a good one. He reported that after quail were withheld from water for 36 hours, they produced eggshells 29% thinner. And he also found that parathion caused 4.8% thinner shells, 7 caused, that's a pesticide, carbaryl, caused 8% thinning, mercury caused 8.6% thinning, and lead caused 14% thinner shells. But DDT and DDE caused no shell thinning, and orthopara DDT caused 5% thicker shells to be formed. So it's pretty hard to blame shell thinning. You can also blame shell thinning on bird diseases such as Newcastle disease, rickettsial pox, avian bronchitis, and avian malaria, which are prevented by the use of pesticides. Thicker shells, yes, Jeffrey fed his finches 300 micrograms a day of DDT, causing calcium metabolism to tend toward the production of heavier shells, 7% thicker than normal. That was in Wildlife Management Journal. And then to measure eggshell thickness, big book by Klaus and Bolander, which was almost unavailable, had 300 pages on DDT. And this especially, I was interested in the exposure of how they measured eggshell thickness using a screw micrometer. Put a hole through the eggshell, tighten the screw, and you see how thick the eggshell is. And they measured these to the nearest 0.01 millimeters. In other words, the nearest 10 microns. In some cases, they reported a significant thinning, the difference of 5 to 7 microns. And Klaus and Bolander reminded us that human red blood cells 8 microns across, human hair may be 50 to 80 microns in diameter. So an eggshell that's only 5 microns thinner, it's pretty hard to say it's caused by DDT or anything else, especially since they have shown in the book by Romanoff on the avian egg, shown that as the embryo develops, the calcium is withdrawn from the eggshell to form the eggs in the embryo. Well, I'd like to talk about biomagnification, but I don't have time. However, one more thing that I thought might interest you, talking about, Edgar Wayburn, the Sierra Club president, anti-DDT activist, wrote in California Medicine, November 1970, quote, in Sarawak recently, spraying for malaria led to biological magnification of DDT through food chains. Cats died after eating DDT-loaded geckos and cockroaches. The rats then multiplied until there were threats of plague. Replacement cats had to be parachuted into the villages to keep down the rats. End of quote. Well, Dr. Thomas Jukes responded in the February issue of that magazine, stating, quote, the program to which Wayburn objected had, according to the World Health Organization, saved 5 million lives and prevented 100 million illnesses in the first 8 years of its use, without causing any symptoms in 130,000 spray men or the 585 million inhabitants of the sprayed houses. These were World Health Organization figures. He says the cat rat story first appeared as a Vietnam anecdote in the New York Times, and the parachuting of cats occurred in North Borneo as a result of Dieldrin deaths of cats, not DDT. Jukes also pointed out that DDT as applied has not caused any side effects among any domestic animals, including cats. The LD50 of DDT for cats is about 300 milligrams per kilogram of body weight, and DDT has an LD50 of 25 micrograms per roach. Therefore, Jukes concluded, quote, a 5-kilo cat would have to eat 60,000 cockroaches in one day to ingest a lethal dose of DDT. Be more likely to die from ruptured intestines. or from physical exhaustion, because the cat would have to catch 42 roaches per minute for 24 hours and would probably be too busy with the roaches to chase many geckos. Well, Ralph Audie, the person who wrote the story that led to Wayburn's article, Audie responded to Jukes saying touché, he said, but he also said, quote, I wrote my article in too much of a hurry while traveling abroad and did not check that story. I will accept that cats will not be killed acutely by eating either geckos or cockroaches. But what are the prospects for chronic poisoning following biological magnification? This leads me to remember somebody said, what would the world be like if there were no hypothetical questions? Anyway, Wayburn finally replied, whether it was Dieldrin or DDT that killed the cats, and whether by direct or indirect ingestion, the moral of the story remains true. Now, we had a couple of other quotes that I thought were interesting from news media. I know that you probably have heard these, but I like to repeat them. Ben Bradley, the Washington Post editor, stated, I'm no longer interested in news, I'm interested in causes. We don't pretend to print the truth, we print what people tell us. It's up to the public to decide what's true, unquote. And Charles Alexander said, quote, as the science editor at Time, I freely admit that on the environment we have crossed the line from news reporting to advocacy. And so that kind of reporting, what do you expect? Then we had the whole biological, I have 2 more minutes, I believe, like my clock. DDT in the ocean, oh yes, this I can finish up with it. In 1971, Philip Butler reported, reported that, this is a quote, as much as 25% of the DDT produced to date may have been transferred to the sea, unquote. 2 other panels of the National Academy of Science refuted that report. However, the Washington Post expanded on it, saying nearly 25% of all DDT manufactured to date is now in the world's oceans, where it is killing baby fish, unquote. And Jacques Cousteau may be confused. In his testimony before the Senate Commerce Committee, he said, quote, for example, we now know that 25% of all DDT compounds so far produced are already in the sea, and finally they will all end up in the sea, unquote. So we had a false estimate of how much DDT may have gotten into the sea, made by the man whose own Gulf Breeze laboratory showed that DDT breaks down rapidly in seawater. And this was escalated to a solid statement by the Washington Post and alleged to kill baby fish, which was never shown. It was then blown out of context by Cousteau, warning that all the DDT metabolites ever produced will finally end up in the sea. Lastly, in the EPA hearings, we had a lot of fun with those hearings. 9,300 pages of hearings. You could base a college course on the hearings of those hearings. During the 6 months of hearing, George Woodwell testified about an article written by him and Charles Worcester in Science magazine. The abstract said, DDT residues in an extensive salt marsh on the south shore of Long Island average more than 13 pounds per acre. I'll spare you page numbers. Questioned by the attorney cross-examining, isn't it a fact that after you initially studied this marsh, you continued your samplings and found as a result that you were getting an average of 1 pound per acre instead of 13? Answer, no, I wouldn't agree with that. Question, didn't you also find out that one of the areas you took your samples was an area convenient for the Mosquito Commission spray truck to clean out? I can't say I discovered that either. I don't believe there's any evidence to that effect, said Dr. Woodwell. Question, did Dr. Worcester perhaps? Worcester was sitting in the audience that day, by the way. I don't believe he knows that either. Answer, I don't believe there's any evidence to that effect. Question, Dr. Worcester, your co-author, made the following statement at Washington State hearings. I'm quoting him verbatim. He testified, quote, we have since sampled the marsh more extensively and we found the average in the marsh was closer to 1 pound per acre. No evidence at all, huh? The discrepancy was because our initial sampling was in a convenient place. It was convenient for the mosquito bait spray truck too. Did you learn that after the fact, Doctor? Answer, that is a true statement in my experience. I didn't know Dr. Worcester had said that, but that is a true statement. Well, Doctor, have you ever published a retraction of this 13 pounds per acre, or a further article which discloses the results of your further sampling and brings the average down from 13 to around 1 pound per acre? Answer, I never thought this was necessary. Later, he also was questioned about his heavily sprayed forest in New Brunswick, where he said the concentration in the soil built up to higher levels each of the following years. Fortunately, he was seen doing that by Ewell, who wrote an article saying that he had taken his samples along the edge of the runway where the spray equipment was being calibrated. And that shook him up a little bit. Then he wrote in Science magazine that 6 billion pounds of DDT had been used, but only 12 million pounds could be accounted for in all the Earth's plants, animals, fish, and birds. Less than a 30th of 1 year's production of DDT during the mid-1960s. So he thought most of it had either been degraded to innocuousness or sequestered in places where it is not freely available. That contrasted so much with his testimony that Business Week reporter asked him why that article in Science was completely omitted from his testimony. And Woodrow replied, the EPA lawyers told him not to mention the article lest my testimony be disallowed. So you have this going on for months, and the result was that the hearing examiner declared that DDT should not be banned because it didn't cause cancer or tumors or didn't cause damage to birds, fish, wildlife, or estuarine organisms. And lastly, I enjoyed a book by Somerset Maugham. Maybe I shouldn't say anything. In fact, if I can't find it, I won't say anything. It's regarding what is an idealist. And when I read this, I keep thinking about environmentalists. He says that he saw nothing for himself but only through a literary atmosphere, and was dangerous because he had deceived himself into sincerity. He mistook his vacillation for artistic temperament and his idleness for philosophic calm. His mind was vulgar in its effort at refinement, and saw everything a little larger than life size with the outlines blurred in a golden mist of sentimentality. He lied and never knew he lied, and when it was pointed out to him, he said that lies were beautiful. He was an idealist, or you could say he was a coercive, utopian, environmental extremist. Thank you very much.